Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain started quietly that night, not as a storm, but as a whisper against the window. I was sitting by the small desk in my apartment, a cup of jasmine tea cooling beside me. The lamp cast a soft, amber light, the kind that makes even the walls look gentle. Outside, the city blurred into mist and ripples of light on wet streets. I hadn't opened the curtains fully. I liked seeing the world half hidden, as if distance could make it easier to breathe. It had been a long time since I'd allowed myself to simply sit. For months, maybe years, I'd been moving without direction, chasing new cities, new work, new faces, believing that change could erase the ache I didn't want to name. But sitting there, listening to the rhythm of the rain, I realized I'd been running in circles, carrying the same silence wherever I went. The tea had that faint sweetness that only comes when the leaves have steeped too long. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway, letting the warmth seep into my palms. There was comfort in small things, the clink of ceramic, the hum of the fridge, the gentle tick of the old wall clock. Each sound seemed to remind me, I'm still here. I'm still breathing. When the rain grew heavier, I leaned closer to the window. The glass was cool against my forehead. In the street below, a man hurried under an umbrella, his reflection stretching thin in the puddles. There was something beautiful in his small determination, a stranger fighting his way home through the storm. I envied him for having somewhere to arrive. I thought of the places I had left behind, the old apartment with the leaky roof, the friend who said, stay, but I didn't, the quiet nights when someone waited for my call that never came. I told myself then that I needed space to think, to breathe, to find myself. But as I watched the rain now, I wondered if I had been searching or simply hiding. The light flickered once, then steadied. The room smelled faintly of damp books and tea leaves. I opened the drawer of the desk, meaning to find a pen. I used to write when my thoughts felt too heavy. But what I found instead was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft around the edges. My handwriting, slanted and hurried. The date, 5 years ago. I didn't open it yet. My fingers hesitated, trembling slightly, as if the letter carried a pulse of its own. I remembered writing something that night, a night that felt endless, when everything in me wanted to vanish. And somehow, I had tucked that part of myself away in a drawer, locked behind time and avoidance. The rain outside softened again, turning into a steady rhythm, like the breathing of someone asleep. I lit a small candle on the desk, its flame trembling as if listening. The letter sat there beside the mug, waiting. I could almost feel my younger self sitting across from me, tired, frightened, still believing that healing meant escape. Maybe tonight was different. Maybe I was ready to stop running. I looked around the little room, the uneven books stacked against the wall, the folded blanket on the chair, the quiet amber light tracing the rim of the cup. There was no music, no noise, only rain and a faint beating inside my chest. I took a deep breath, the kind that feels like falling slowly inward. My reflection in the window was faint, half swallowed by night. I whispered to it, as if confessing to a friend. I think I'm ready to find myself again. The candle flickered as though in answer, and so I unfolded the letter. The paper was fragile, creased like skin that had weathered too much time. When I unfolded it, the faint scent of old ink rose, a smell that reminded me of libraries, of notebooks half filled and abandoned. My handwriting looked foreign to me now, uneven, pressed hard into the paper, as if each word had been carved out of urgency. I began to read, but the words trembled before my eyes. I paused and leaned back in my chair, letting the rain's rhythm fill the silence. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier with memory. Shadows from the candle stretched long across the floor, dancing softly on the books in the wall. The letter started simply, "If you ever find this, it means you stayed. I hope you did. I hope you didn't run again." I felt my throat tighten. I could see the version of myself who had written it, exhausted, sitting at this same desk perhaps, the same lamp burning, the same rain outside. I remembered that night now dimly, the ache of wanting to disappear, the silence of the phone that never rang, the loneliness that tasted metallic and sharp. I folded the paper halfway, unable to read further just yet. The candle's flame quivered as I exhaled, and for a moment the room looked softer, like memory itself had grown gentle over time. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had deepened, sheets of silver falling across the streetlights. Cars passed now and then, their headlights slicing through mist. It was a lonely kind of beauty, the kind that holds you without saying anything. The room around me was exactly as it had always been, the wooden desk with scratches from moving too often, the faded curtains, the scent of damp wool from my coat by the door. There was comfort in how unchanged it all felt. Safe, almost, as if this small room had been waiting for me to come home. I sat on the floor by the window, back against the wall, and let the sounds layer over each other, the soft hiss of rain, the clocks ticking, the faint hum of the street below. The quiet between them began to feel like a kind of music. When I finally looked at the letter again, I forced myself to continue reading. You think leaving will fix it, but I promise it follows you. The things you can't forgive yourself for, they find their way into every new room you move into. Until you stop, until you look, until you breathe. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper. My younger self had been right. I had carried my past like luggage across continents, pretending it was gone because I refused to name it. I wondered what else the letter said, but something in me resisted finishing it too soon. I placed it gently on the desk and looked around again. The room had changed in subtle ways, the shadows softer, the air warmer. Perhaps nothing had truly changed, but the way I was seeing it now, no longer as a cage, but as shelter. I noticed little things I hadn't before, the small crack on the mug handle, the curl of wax on the candle's edge, the faint smell of rain sneaking in through the window frame. They felt alive, like silent companions. The rain thickened again, steady and full, drumming softly against the roof. I closed my eyes and let it wash through me. The sound was not of sadness, but of release, as if the whole world was exhaling after holding too much for too long. I thought about the word home, how I'd always imagined it was a place you arrive at, a person waiting, a key turning. But maybe it was something quieter. Maybe home was this, the moment you stop running, the breath you take when you finally say, "I'm here." The candle flickered lower. I placed the letter back on the desk, smoothing it out carefully, and whispered a quiet promise. I won't run tonight. The clock ticked on. Outside, the rain kept falling, calm, steady, endless. Inside, the shadows folded around me like soft arms, and for the first time in years, I didn't want to escape them. I sat there, not thinking, not fixing, not wishing, just breathing. And in that stillness, something fragile began to mend. The next morning began not with sunlight, but with the soft gray of a rain that refused to stop. The world outside the window looked like it was still dreaming mist hanging over the rooftops, drops gathering on the glass, the quiet hum of a city too sleepy to begin. I didn't rush to move. The blanket around my shoulders was heavy and warm, and for once, I let the stillness linger. The letter from last night was still on the desk. I hadn't folded it back up completely, and the edge of the page curled slightly toward the candle stub beside it. It felt like it was breathing, waiting for me to return. I poured fresh water into the kettle, and watched the steam begin to rise. The smell of jasmine filled the room again, and I realized how much I loved that scent. It reminded me of beginnings that never demanded anything. I sat down and began reading the letter from where I had stopped. When you feel lost, don't search for a way out. Sit still. Listen. You already know the way back. It's buried under the noise you keep making. I smiled faintly. I could almost hear my own voice back then, trembling, unsure, but still trying to be kind to itself. It was strange to realize that the person who wrote this letter wasn't gone. They had simply been waiting, patient, beneath all the versions of me I'd become since. The rain grew louder, tapping the window in restless patterns. I leaned closer, following the rhythm. Sometimes the drops merged and slid down the glass together, and I caught myself whispering, "Don't rush. Take your time." I wasn't sure if I was speaking to the rain or to myself. A memory surfaced, then uninvited but gentle. It was of a park bench near the old library, a place I used to visit when I couldn't bear my apartment's silence. I would sit there with my notebook, writing half sentences that never found endings. I remembered the smell of wet soil, the flicker of streetlights through the branches, and the quiet company of strangers walking their dogs. It was the kind of loneliness that didn't hurt. It just existed, softly. I had written another letter there once, not to myself, but to someone I never sent it to, someone I had loved quietly from too far away. The thought made me rise and start looking through the drawers again. Beneath old receipts and folded envelopes, I found another letter, sealed but unmailed. My handwriting again. The date, the same year as the first one. I hesitated, heart fluttering like a moth near flame. Then I tore the envelope open. I miss who I was when you looked at me. You made me kinder to the world, even when I couldn't be kind to myself. I stopped reading there. My throat tightened. It wasn't really about the person. I realized it was about who I had wanted to become through them. That letter wasn't meant for anyone else. It was another message to myself, disguised as love. I folded it gently and placed it beside the first. Two letters, written years apart, both trying to reach the same heart. Outside, the rain softened again, turning to mist. I opened the window just enough for the scent of wet air to drift in. It carried the smell of asphalt, leaves, and something faintly floral like the world had just been washed clean. The room felt alive now. I noticed the small crack in the ceiling I had never bothered to fix, the uneven books stacked too high, the faint watermark on the wall from last year's leak. Imperfect things, but all of them mine, all of them quietly surviving. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The words from the letter echoed softly. Sit still, listen. So I did. I listened to the rain, to the faint hum of the kettle, to the rhythm of my heartbeat syncing with both. Maybe this was what healing really was. Not loud, not triumphant, but small. Like steam curling from a cup of tea. Like rain falling in patterns only you can hear. When I finally opened my eyes again, I whispered to the letters, "Thank you for waiting for me." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it that by evening, the light outside had turned a pale silver, the kind of twilight that blurs the line between day and night. The rain hadn't stopped. It rarely did this time of year, but it had softened into a steady drizzle, a lullaby for the streets below. I watched from the window as people hurried by with umbrellas, their reflections rippling in the puddles like fleeting ghosts. There was something almost comforting about their movements, each person going somewhere, returning from something. I brewed another cup of tea. This time it was chamomile, not jasmine. A calmer scent, less floral, more like hay and honey. I sat at the desk, both letters lying side by side, their creases almost identical, as if they were siblings separated by time. I didn't plan to write anything new that night. I thought I'd just sit, listen to the rain, maybe read a book. But something in the quiet began to pull at me, a small voice beneath the hum of the world. I found myself picking up a pen. The ink flowed easily, as though it had been waiting. Without thinking, I began to write not to anyone, not even to myself, just to the silence, to the space that had opened up since I stopped running. Somewhere along the way, I started believing that leaving was the only way to live. Every time I felt pain, I moved. Every time something cracked inside me, I changed cities, jobs, faces. I thought movement was healing, but it was just another form of hiding. I paused, listening. The rain had shifted, falling in soft sheets against the window. It sounded like applause, gentle and constant. Maybe healing isn't about fixing what broke. Maybe it's about sitting with the pieces until they stop feeling foreign. I set the pen down, breathing out slowly. The candlelight flickered across the page, bending the shadows on the wall. It was strange how quiet the room felt now. Not empty, but full with rain, with memory, with something that almost felt like peace. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. My mind wandered back to all the places I'd run through. The train stations at midnight, the dimly lit hostels, the smell of unfamiliar kitchens, the sound of rain in cities where no one knew my name. I had convinced myself that I loved freedom, but maybe I had just been afraid of staying. A flash of a memory came years ago, a narrow street by the river. I had walked there one night, angry for reasons I can no longer remember. The rain had just begun then, small and insistent. I saw my reflection in a puddle and stepped through it on purpose, wanting to blur myself. I laughed then, bitterly, at how easily I disappeared, but I didn't realize, until now, that what I truly wanted was to be seen by myself most of all. The thought made me open my eyes. I turned toward the window, where the lamplight from the street below shimmered through the rain. The glass was fogged, but I could still make out my reflection, a faint outline, soft and uncertain. I raised a hand and touched it, as if greeting an old friend. "You're still here," I whispered. The words came out shaky, but they were true. The clock ticked softly behind me. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, followed by laughter echoing down the street. The world was still moving. But inside this small room, time had gentled its pace. I got up and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, standing near the open window, just enough to feel the mist on my skin. It was cool and clean, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like the rain was something I had to hide from. It felt like it was welcoming me back. The smell of chamomile, the hum of water on glass, the candle's golden glow, it all mixed together into something wordless but whole. I looked again at the letters on the desk, at the ink lines that had carried my past selves. Maybe I hadn't been running away from pain. Maybe I had been running toward understanding, just taking the longest road possible. Tonight, for the first time, I felt I had arrived, not at a destination, but at myself. And as the rain whispered against the glass, I whispered back, "I'm home." Later that night, when the streets outside had emptied and only the rain kept its rhythm, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat near the window again. The room had grown colder, the air heavy with mist sneaking through the cracks. The lamplight shimmered against the droplets on the glass, turning them into tiny stars that trembled with each gust of wind. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed soft and slow. It must have been the cafe across the street, the one that always stayed open late. I'd never gone inside before. I used to pass it on my way home, glancing through the fogged windows. At the people inside, couples whispering over coffee, someone reading by the corner, a barista cleaning glasses with tired grace. It had always looked like another world. One eye was too restless to enter, but tonight, something in me stirred a quiet pull, like a thread being gently tugged. I put on my coat, and stepped outside. The rain greeted me like an old friend. It wasn't harsh anymore. It was soft, steady, almost playful as it tapped against my hood. The air smelled of wet pavement and coffee beans, and every light shimmered on the ground like scattered fireflies. My footsteps splashed through shallow puddles, and for once, I didn't hurry. When I pushed open the cafe door, a small bell rang overhead. The warmth hit me instantly, the hum of quiet jazz, the scent of roasted coffee, the faint sweetness of something baking in the back. The place was nearly empty. A young man behind the counter looked up and smiled in that easy, unforced way. People do when they've spent all night with rain for company. Cold out there? He asked. A little, I said, returning the smile. My voice sounded softer than I expected, like it had finally learned not to echo. I chose a table near the window. From there, I could still see my apartment, its dim light, a small square across the street, framed by the rain. It looked peaceful, almost like it belonged to someone else. The barista brought me a cup of black tea, steam curling upward in thin spirals. This one's on the house, he said. You looked like you needed warmth more than caffeine. I thanked him quietly. As I wrapped my hands around the cup, I noticed how familiar the gesture felt, just like earlier, at my desk, when I held jasmine tea in that same way. The warmth seeped into my fingers, then deeper, until it felt like it was melting something frozen inside. At the far end of the cafe, an old radio played softly. A woman's voice low, Smokey sang a tune about distance and coming home. Her words blurred into the rain outside, and I couldn't tell where the song ended and the weather began. I watched the drops race down the window pane, some merging, some parting halfway. The street light outside painted everything gold and silver, reflections shimmering on the pavement. I thought about how many nights I had passed places like this, too busy running to notice them. How many moments of calm I had turned away from, believing I didn't deserve them yet. Someone opened the cafe door, and a gust of cool air swept in. I looked up, expecting no one I knew, and of course, it wasn't anyone. Just a stranger shaking, the rain from their coat, their hair glistening under the light. But as they smiled politely in my direction, I realized something simple and beautiful. I didn't need to know them for the world to feel kind again. The stranger ordered, sat a few tables away, and opened a book. The barista hummed along to the radio. Outside, the rain fell on, unbothered and endless. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. I stayed there for a while, sipping slowly, watching the reflections blur and reform on the glass. The cafe was quiet, but alive the clink of cups, the turning of a page, the faint rhythm of raindrops sliding down. When I finally stood to leave, the barista waved. "Come by again," he said, his voice warm. "I think I will," I replied. And I meant it not as I stepped back into the rain. I didn't open my umbrella. I let the drops fall freely, soaking into my coat, cooling my skin. The air felt fresh, the kind of cold that wakes you up gently. I looked back at the cafe, the golden light spilling onto the street, the silhouettes moving inside, and something in my chest eased. Across the shimmering street, my apartment window glowed softly. And for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. I walked home slowly, smiling into the rain. When I returned to my room, it was exactly as I'd left it, the candle half burned, the blanket draped loosely over the chair, and the 2 old letters resting quietly on the desk. But something inside me had changed, in a way too subtle to describe. The rain was still falling outside, yet it no longer felt like background noise. It was part of me now, like breath or heartbeat. I hung my coat on the hook and sat again by the window. The cup of chamomile tea I'd abandoned earlier was cold, but I didn't mind. I simply held it, tracing the rim with my finger. A faint smile formed without reason. The cafe across the street glowed warmly, a little beacon in the mist. I could see the barista wiping down the counter, preparing to close. The stranger with the book was gone. Soon the lights would go out, leaving only the rain to keep watch. I picked up one of the letters, then the other. The paper felt softer now, less like an artifact of pain, and more like something living. I read them again slowly, whispering the words aloud as if speaking to an old friend. When you feel lost, don't search for a way out. Sit still, listen. You think leaving will fix it, but I promise it follows you. Every word felt like it belonged to the rain itself, as though time had folded and I was both the one writing and the one listening. And then I began to speak quietly to the room, to the version of myself who had written those letters, to the person I had been in all those cities and sleepless nights. I'm sorry, I said, for leaving so many times, for thinking you weren't enough unless you were somewhere else, for running when you only wanted to rest. The words hung in the air like mist, dissolving slowly. But as they disappeared, something light bloomed inside me, relief, or forgiveness, or maybe both. The candle flickered out with a soft sigh. I didn't bother relighting it. The rain was enough light now. It shimmered faintly on the window pane, a silver glow in the dark. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt the coolness against my skin. It reminded me of someone's hand I once held, just a friend, nothing more, but the memory carried warmth all the same. We had been sitting on a park bench, watching a storm roll in. I had been afraid that day, afraid of saying too much, of revealing how hollow I felt. But he just smiled and said, "You don't always have to talk. Sometimes being here is enough." At the time, I didn't understand. But now, years later, I did that. Sometimes being here really is enough. I turned from the window and looked around the room again. Every object seemed to glow softly in the dim light. The books stacked unevenly, the mug with the tiny crack, a small puddle of melted wax on the desk. These weren't signs of neglect anymore. They were proof of living. I knelt to open the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a small wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside it were scattered bits of old life, photographs, train tickets, coins from cities whose names I'd nearly forgotten. I picked one up, a photo of myself, younger, standing by the sea. My hair was messy, my smile too wide. I could almost feel the salt in the air again. I didn't feel sadness, only tenderness. I whispered, "You were trying your best." The rain softened again, like an exhale. I put the photo back, closed the drawer, and sat back in the chair. I felt the stillness fill me, not as emptiness, but as calm. The letters on the desk seemed to hum faintly in the silence, as if satisfied that I had finally understood their message. Healing, I realized, wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was a quiet returning to breath, to body, to the simple act of noticing the world again. I poured myself one last cup of tea, the last of the jasmine leaves. The steam rose gently, blurring my reflection in the window. I watched it fade, then return, then fade again, like a wave dot, and for the first time, I didn't wish to be anyone else, anywhere else, living any other life. The rain whispered its slow song, and I whispered back, "I'm staying." The night deepened, folding itself around me like a familiar blanket. The world outside was hushed, save for the steady breath of rain against the window. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand silence. It simply is. I moved closer to the desk again, tracing my fingers over the edge of the two old letters. For years, they had been locked away, forgotten, but now they felt like company. I took out a clean sheet of paper. It had been a long time since I'd written anything just for myself, not for work or necessity. The paper glowed faintly in the lamplight, blank but patient, as if waiting for my truth to arrive. At first, I didn't know where to begin. My pen hovered, hesitating in the air. Then, without forcing it, I wrote the words that had been echoing in my chest for days. Dear me, thank you for coming back. The ink bled slightly into the fibers, soft and imperfect. I smiled. My handwriting had changed over the years, rounder, slower, less sharp. Maybe I had changed that way too. I continued. I thought healing would be loud. I thought it would come with fireworks, closure, forgiveness, neatly folded and tied with a ribbon. But it's nothing like that. It's just this, a cup of tea, a rainy night, a letter you once forgot to open. I paused, sipping from the tea beside me. It had gone lukewarm, but the taste still grounded me. You've spent so long trying to become someone new, but maybe what you needed was to remember who you already were before you started running. The one who used to listen to the rain without thinking of escape. The one who found peace in small things, the smell of wet earth, the sound of a kettle boiling, the first page of a good book. You never lost that person. You just left them waiting. I stopped and listened. Outside, the rain had softened again, as if agreeing. Somewhere distant, thunder rumbled, but it sounded tired, not angry. The storm was nearly over. So this is me, returning. Not perfect, not finished, but finally still enough to hear myself again. I looked at what I'd written and felt tears sting my eyes, not out of sadness, but relief. For the first time, I wasn't writing to fix myself. I was writing to acknowledge that I was already whole, even in pieces. The air in the room shifted lighter somehow, gentler. The candle had long gone out, and the lamp's golden glow painted the walls in calm shades of amber. I could smell the faint sweetness of wax, the musty comfort of paper, the clean scent of rain drifting in through the cracked window. I folded the new letter carefully, then placed it beside the old two. 3 now passed, lost and found. I sat back in the chair and watched the faint steam still rising from my tea. The silence wrapped around me like soft fabric. For years, I had been terrified of silence, of what it might say. But now it was kind, generous even. It held me without questions. Outside, a car splashed through a puddle, headlights flashing briefly across my ceiling. For a moment, I thought of all the nights I had wandered through other cities, searching for something to fill the emptiness. How strange that it ended here, not in a new place, but in the same room I had once wanted to leave. I smiled faintly at the thought. Maybe healing wasn't about new beginnings at all. Maybe it was about returning to where you started and seeing it differently. I leaned forward and whispered softly, "Thank you for staying through the storm." I wasn't sure who I was speaking to the rain, my past self or the quiet presence that had carried me through. Maybe all of them. The rain slowed to a drizzle. A single drop clung to the glass, trembling before sliding down, joining the rest. I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared. The moment felt complete. Not grand, not final, just whole. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle. The rain's song continued, soft and steady, as if promising to keep watch until morning got, and as I drifted toward sleep, one thought lingered gently. Healing begins when we stop running. When I woke the next morning, the rain was still there, soft, steady, and familiar, like a voice that hadn't left during the night. The room was bathed in a faint gray light. Everything looked quieter in the morning after rain. The books seemed to breathe slower. The floor creaked more gently. Even the clock's ticking felt less impatient. I sat up slowly, still wrapped in the blanket from the night before. The air smelled clean, with traces of tea and candle wax lingering. For a moment, I just listened. No plans, no rush, only the sound of the world reminding me that it was still turning. I poured myself another cup of tea and carried it to the window. The city looked softer than usual, wrapped in mist. Drops hung from the branches of the tree, outside like little glass beads catching the pale morning light. Across the street, the cafe's door was still closed, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. It felt strange, being awake without the weight of running. I hadn't realized how much noise lived in my head lists, worries, things I thought I had to fix. This morning, they were gone, replaced by a quiet I didn't need to fight. I opened the window slightly. The chill air rushed in, cool and damp, brushing my face. The smell of wet pavement and blooming jasmine mixed in the air, faint but real. I took a deep breath, feeling it settle into me like a calm tide. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I began to listen to my own breathing. In. Out. It was uneven at first, shallow from years of habit. But as I focused, it softened, deepened, and found a rhythm that matched the rain. I closed my eyes and let it happen. Each breath was an invitation to stay here, in this room, in this body, in this life. Thoughts came, of course. They always do. Regrets, names, half-finished stories. But instead of pushing them away, I let them pass through, like raindrops sliding down glass. They belonged here too. For a while, I thought about the person I had been, the one who believed healing would mean forgetting, the one who packed bags every time the air felt too heavy. I could see that version of me now, tired but trying, standing somewhere in the rain years ago. I whispered softly, "It's okay now. You can rest." A small smile found its way to my lips, the kind that comes not from joy, but from recognition. I reached for the letters on the desk, all 3 of them. I didn't open them this time. I just held them in my hands, feeling their thin weight. They were proof not of pain, but of endurance, of the quiet persistence it takes to come back to yourself. On impulse, I took the new letter, the one I had written last night, and slid it into an envelope. On the front, I wrote only one word, "Stay." Then I placed it in the drawer where the first letter had slept for years. It felt right, like completing a circle. Outside, a few birds began to sing between the pauses of rain. Their calls were faint, uncertain, but hopeful. I leaned my forehead against the window, smiling at the sound. Even the sky, gray as it was, seemed to hold a promise in it. I spent the rest of the morning moving slowly. I changed the sheets, folded the blanket neatly, wiped the table. I washed the mug, dried it, and placed it upside down beside the kettle. Every small act felt like tending to something sacred. For the first time, I understood that healing wasn't found in grand gestures. It lived in these quiet repetitions, the care we give to ordinary things, the attention we offer to moments no one else will see. As I sat back down with a fresh cup of tea, I realized I didn't need the rain to stop anymore. I wasn't waiting for a clear day to begin again. This gentle gray, this quiet was enough. I whispered a soft thank you to the room, to the rain, to all the versions of myself who had waited for this morning. And when I closed my eyes, I didn't feel lost. I felt whole. That afternoon, the clouds began to lift. Not completely, just enough for a pale light to spill through, soft and uneven, like it was still learning how to be sun again. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, falling in long, lazy drops that tapped the window in a rhythm, almost like breathing. I sat in my chair, hands folded loosely in my lap, and felt the stillness stretch out around me. Something in that quiet made me think of the past, not in a heavy way, but gently, like turning the pages of an old book. I found myself imagining what it would be like to meet my younger self again, not in a dream, but in some small corner of this same city. In my mind, it was evening. The streets glistened with leftover rain, and the air smelled of wet stone and faint smoke from nearby stalls. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, I saw her, me, younger, thinner, eyes always scanning the ground, as though afraid of being seen. She was standing there in a too large coat, hair damp from the drizzle, clutching a notebook against her chest like a shield. I walked up slowly, afraid to startle her. She didn't look up at first. I could tell she was exhausted, not just from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. When she finally noticed me, her eyes widened not in recognition, but in the kind of cautious wonder you have when someone seems familiar in a way you can't explain. "You look tired," I said softly. She gave a half smile. "I'm fine. Just cold." Her voice was the same as mine, only lighter, less certain. "Here," I said, taking off my scarf and wrapping it around her shoulders. She didn't resist. The fabric darkened slightly from the rain, but it looked warm against her skin. We stood there for a moment under the streetlight, neither speaking. Around us, the city murmured, the distant sound of a bus engine, the steady drip from a broken gutter, a passing conversation fading into the night. "I know you," she said finally. "Don't I?" "Maybe," I replied. "Maybe I'm just someone who remembers you." Her expression softened. "Then you know I'm tired of running." I nodded. "I know. You can rest soon. You don't have to keep trying so hard." Her eyes glistened with something that looked like both fear and hope. "If I stop, won't everything fall apart?" "It already did," I said gently. "And you're still here." She blinked at that, as if the words were foreign. I wanted to reach out, to hold her face in my hands, to tell her that the storm she was drowning in would one day become her quiet. But instead, I just offered a small, reassuring smile. "Come," I said. "Let's walk a bit." We began walking through the wet streets, sharing the same umbrella. The world smelled of rain-soaked leaves and coffee grounds from a nearby shop. Our footsteps echoed softly, in sync. She glanced at me now and then, as though studying the way I carried myself slower, calmer, unhurried. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked. "What?" "Breathe like that. Like the world doesn't scare you anymore." I thought for a moment. "It still does," I admitted. "But now I know the fear passes faster if I stay." We stopped by a bakery where warm air spilled out each time the door opened. The smell of bread and sugar mixed with the damp air, and I could feel her shoulders ease beneath the scarf. She looked at me, then really looked, and for the first time, I saw a trace of peace on her face. "I think I'll try staying," she whispered. I smiled. "That's all you ever needed to do." The drizzle thickened again, and the light from the street lamp glowed in golden rings through the mist. When I turned back toward her, she was gone. Only the scarf remained, folded neatly on the bench beneath the light. I stood there for a while, letting the rain fall on my hair and shoulders. It didn't feel lonely. It felt like closure, quiet and unspoken. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room. The window was fogged, the teacup empty, the clock ticking softly. The rain outside sounded the same as it had in my memory, but now it carried something new, a kind of hush that felt like forgiveness. I touched the window pane, and for a moment, I swore I could feel the warmth of that younger self still standing beneath the streetlight, whispering back through the rain, "Thank you for coming to find me." That night, the rain returned in waves, first a whisper, then a steady rhythm drumming across rooftops, windows, and the leaves of the tree outside my window. The city lights flickered faintly through the mist, turning everything into shades of gold and gray. I sat at my desk again, the lamp dim, the air filled with that quiet hum that comes only after a long storm. The window had fogged over completely now, transforming into a soft mirror. I could see myself in it, blurred, haloed by candlelight. For a moment, I simply looked. My reflection wasn't perfect. There were faint shadows beneath my eyes, a streak of silver at the edge of my hair, the softened lines that time leaves behind. But instead of flinching, I smiled It had taken years for me to meet my own gaze without judgment. Years to look at the person I'd become and not wish to edit or erase them. Now, under this gentle light, I saw something I hadn't before. Not strength exactly, but softness. The quiet kind that survives storms without trying to. I leaned closer to the glass, tracing the fog with my fingertip, and whispered, "You're doing okay." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and unhurried. The kind that sounds more like a sigh than a warning. I thought of how many times I'd heard that same sound from different places, different cities, hotel windows, borrowed rooms, and how it had always felt like a reminder that I was somewhere in between. But tonight, the thunder didn't sound far away. It felt close, like a heartbeat. I picked up the 3 letters again. I unfolded them one last time and laid them side by side across the desk. The ink had faded slightly in the older ones, but the words were still clear. Sit still. Listen. Stay. I ran my fingers over each one as if tracing a path back through time. They were no longer messages from someone lost. They were evidence of a conversation that had always been happening inside me, waiting for me to finally listen. A soft breeze slipped through the open window, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and night-blooming flowers. It made the candle flame sway, throwing the shadows across the walls in waves. I watched the light dance, feeling both small and infinite dot in the distance. A rooftop gutter overflowed, spilling a curtain of water down into the alley. The sound was almost like applause, a tender celebration of nothing in particular, just existence itself. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The rain, the thunder, the breath, all of it merged into one rhythm. For years, I had mistaken stillness for stagnation, quiet for emptiness. Now I knew better. This silence was alive, it pulsed, it moved, it spoke. When I opened my eyes, the mirror of the window had cleared slightly. I could see my reflection more clearly now, framed by the city's faint light. My own eyes looked back at me with something new, an understanding that didn't need words. Healing hadn't made me someone else. It had simply brought me home to the person I had always been beneath the noise. I turned off the lamp, letting the glow from the streetlight outside take its place. The room shifted into soft gray. The sound of the rain grew louder for a moment, like a curtain closing after a quiet performance. I whispered into the dark, "I forgive you." The words felt weightless, as if they had been waiting for years just to be spoken aloud. The rain seemed to answer, softening against the glass. Wrapping the world in its calm dot, I stayed there, unmoving, until the candle burned down to its wick. Then I stood and walked toward the window one last time. My reflection blurred again, as a new wave of rain rolled down the glass, and I smiled at the sight of it. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to be seen by my own eyes. Outside, the city slept. Inside, I did too wide awake in the quiet of my own being. The next day arrived softly, like a sigh after a long conversation. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind streets glistening with leftover rain and rooftops steaming gently in the shy morning light. From my window, I could see the clouds breaking apart, threads of pale blue woven into the gray. The sound of dripping gutters marked the rhythm of a world returning to calm. I brewed a pot of tea, again this time green, clean and bright, and opened the window wider. The air that came in smelled of rain-soaked wood, street dust, and something faintly sweet from a nearby bakery. It was the kind of scent that makes you believe, even for a moment, that everything has been reset. Across the street, the cafe was open again. The same barista from before stood at the door, waiting to a customer. I watched as he smiled easily, the way people do when they've made peace with the morning. Something about that small gesture made me realize how much I'd missed human warmth, the quiet reassurance of being seen, even by strangers. I thought about the people who had stayed in my life despite my distance, the ones who had sent messages I never answered, the ones who hadn't stopped caring even when I pulled away. There was a time I believed silence protected me. Now I understood it had only made me smaller. On impulse, I picked up my phone. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the screen. I didn't know what to say after all this time, how to reach across the quiet I had built. But then I remembered the words I'd written to myself. Stay dot, so I started small. I messaged an old friend, the one who had once waited for my call that never came. My fingers trembled as I typed. Hi, it's been a while. I just wanted to say, I hope you're doing well. I think about you sometimes, especially on rainy days. I hit send before I could overthink it. The message left with a small whoosh, disappearing into the digital distance. I didn't expect a reply, not really. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about opening a window, even just a little, and letting light in again. I sat back and took a sip of tea. It was still too hot, but the warmth felt good against my palms. Outside, a bird hopped along the wet railing, shaking its feathers dry. The city was beginning to stir, the low hum of traffic blending with the lingering scent of rain. Then, unexpectedly, my phone buzzed. I'm glad you wrote, the message said. I've missed you too. Maybe we could have coffee sometime? I read it twice, smiling before I even realized I was. The simplicity of it, no questions, no blame felt like sunlight. I typed back a short reply, something gentle. I'd like that. Maybe soon. When I set the phone down, my heart felt light in a way I hadn't known it could. Connection to me, fragile, real, had found its way back. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning the room. It wasn't out of duty, but gratitude. I opened the curtains fully, letting the weak sunlight spill over the desk. I dusted the shelves, folded the blanket, replaced the candle. The 3 letters remained on the table, but I didn't hide them again. They could stay where I could see them, proof that even in silence, we are always in conversation with ourselves, Doc, as I moved around the room. I hummed a tune I didn't remember learning. Maybe I had heard it once long ago, in a cafe or on a train. The melody fit the morning perfectly, soft, unfinished, but content. I brewed an extra cup of tea and set it on the opposite side of the desk, where the steam rose lazily. A small offering to the part of me that had carried me through the storm. Then I sat down, pen in hand, and began a new letternet one for myself this time, but for the friend I would soon meet. The words came easily. There's something I've learned about storms, I wrote. They don't always mean destruction. Sometimes they're just the world asking you to pause long enough to listen to yourself again. I stopped there, smiling. Maybe I'd never send it. Maybe it didn't matter. Outside, a patch of sunlight fell across the wet street, and for a brief, beautiful moment, everything shimmered else. Glass, even the tiny raindrops still clinging to the railing dot. It looked like the world was exhaling. And I, too, finally did dot by afternoon. The air felt lighter. The city had shaken the rain off its shoulders, and a soft golden hue began to warm the edges of Think's rooftops. The railings, the little cafe sign swinging gently in the breeze. The clouds were parting, leaving behind streaks of pale blue that looked almost shy after so many gray days. I opened the window wider, letting sunlight spill onto the floorboards. The room felt different now. Not newer, not rearranged, but alive. As if it had been waiting for light to return, for air to move again. I decided to clean, not because it needed to be done, but because it felt like an act of care-like tending to a heartbeat. I began by gathering the old books scattered near the bed, stacking them neatly on the shelf. Some of them still carried the faint scent of damp paper. I ran my hand along their spines, remembering how each one had once been a refuge during lonely nights. Then I changed the sheets. The crisp sound of fabric snapping open filled the quiet, and I smiled. It had been so long since I'd done something so small, yet felt so purposeful. I tucked the corners carefully, smoothing out the creases. The bed looked like a promise of rest. On the desk, I wiped away the fine layer of dust that had gathered around the base of the lamp. The glass of the window caught my reflection again, this time framed by sunlight instead of candlelight. I looked softer somehow, less like someone waiting for life to start. The kettle whistled, and I poured another cup of tea. The steam rose in gentle spirals, catching the light like threads of silk. I placed the cup beside the three letters me quiet with necessity, sat down. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant laughter from the street, the rustle of leaves outside. It was strange how full silence could be. Once you stopped fearing it, my eyes drifted to the drawer of one where the first letter had slept for years. I opened it, not to add or remove anything, but just to look. Inside were tiny fragments of life, paper clips, postcards, an old metro ticket, a seashell I'd carried back from a trip long forgotten. Each item was a small reminder of a person I had been. Not mistakes, not ghosts, just versions of me, each trying their best. I placed the seashell on the windowsill. It caught the sunlight beautifully, its spiral shimmering faintly like it was breathing. I pressed it to my ear out of habit. It didn't sound like the sea, not real limit. I could almost imagine it. That low, eternal hush. A breeze came through the open window, carrying the faint scent of rain and dusk. It lifted the edges of the letters on the desk, making them flutter slightly, as if they were alive and sighing in contentment. I took another slow sip of tea and realized something quiet but clear. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for answers, not for the rain to end, not for some future version of myself to arrive and save me. I was already here, and that was enough. I stood by the window again, resting my forehead against the glass. Below, the street glimmered in the sunlight. The puddles were shrinking, but a few still reflected the sky like tiny fragments of heaven. Across the street, the cafe door opened. A familiar figure stepped out the barista, carrying a tray of cups, smiling at the sky as if greeting an old friend. I almost laughed. How strange and beautiful it was that the world went on so gently, even when we were breaking. And even when we began to heal, I stayed there until the sun dipped lower, the light turning golden and soft. My hands rested on the windowsill, the wood warm beneath my fingers. The rain had left faint streaks on the glass, tiny reminders that it had been hereen, that it had passed. Behind me, the room glowed with quiet warmth. The bed, the books, the desk thief, all seemed to hum softly, alive in their stillness. I realized then that healing wasn't something that arrived like light. It was something that grew quietly, like plants leaning toward the sun. I whispered, half to myself, half to the room, "Thank you for waiting." And for the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't ache. It embraced. That evening, the sunlight lingered longer than usual, as if it too didn't want to leave. The sky outside turned a gentle amber, clouds drifting like soft bruises fading to gold. I sat by the window again, my tea gone cold but untouched, watching the world breathe in quiet rhythm. Everything felt suspended in that in-between hour, when day loosens its grip and night hasn't yet arrived. It was in that stillness that I felt the need to write again, it from restlessness, but from gratitude. The letters on my desk had become companions now, their folded shapes almost sacred. I took a blank sheet from the drawer and laid it before me. The paper caught the light, warm and inviting. This one, I decided, wouldn't be about the past or the pain. It would be about what comes after, about staying. Dear me, I began. This is not a letter of apology or even of reflection. This is a promise. The pen glided easily, the words finding me as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. I promise to stay when the silence feels too heavy, when the night feels too long, to stay when the world moves faster than I can breathe. I promise to rest when I am weary instead of running away. I promise to be patient with the parts of me that are still learning how to be soft. I paused, listening to the sound of the wind brushing through the half-open window. It carried with it the scent of rain-soaked earth, faintly sweet and clean. Somewhere far away, someone was playing a slow tune on a piano. The notes drifted faintly through the dusk, curling around the edges of the evening like smoke. I promised to forgive the versions of myself that didn't know better, I continued. They were only trying to survive. I promised to forgive the silence, the leaving, the running. They were ways of reaching for safety. And now, I promise to build safety here in this small room, in this still heart, in this breath. The music in the distance stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft rustle of curtains swaying. The city seemed to exhale. I looked around the room, the bed now neat and sunlit, the shelves in quiet order, the seashell glowing faintly on the sill. Everything felt deliberate, chosen. I realized that these small acts of care had become a language, a dialogue between my hands and my heart. I promise to be here when joy returns, I wrote, to welcome it like rain after drought, to laugh without waiting for permission, to cry without shame, to live slowly enough to feel everything, even the tender ache of being alive. When I set the pen down, the page was full, no grand endings, no polished phrases, just truth, written plainly. I folded the paper carefully and sealed it in an envelope. On the front, I wrote only one word, remain. I placed it beside the others on the desk. 4 letters now at one, marking a step along the quiet road back to myself. Outside, the sky was shifting again. The first stars began to appear, faint against the blue that deepened with each breath. The rain had left behind tiny glimmers on the power lines, catching the last of the light. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, letting my eyes adjust. The city below glowed softly, windows flickering like constellations. Somewhere, laughter drifted from a nearby apartment. A dog barked once, then settled. The world, ordinary and vast, felt suddenly tender. In the quiet, I whispered the promise again, this time aloud, I will remain. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the air like a vow already kept. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt no pull to move, to flee, to change. Only the steady heartbeat of belonging to this room, this rain, this life. When I opened my eyes again, the stars had brightened, scattered gently across the thinning clouds. Their reflection shimmered faintly in the puddles below. I smiled, knowing morning would come again, and I would still be here awake, breathing, home. The morning that followed was pale and tender, as if the sky itself was waking slowly after a long dream. The rain had stopped completely. All that remained were the quiet traces it left behind, tiny beads of water trembling on the window frame, the scent of damp soil rising from the streets below, the faint shimmer of dew on the leaves of the tree outside. I stayed in bed for a while, not out of laziness, but because the stillness felt like something sacred. The light filtered softly through the curtains, warm and muted. Somewhere, a bird was singing a hesitant tune that carried through the calm air like a fragile confession. When I finally sat up, my body felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had slipped away during the night. I stretched, breathed deeply, and smiled at the quiet. There was no rush, no list, no noise demanding to be answered. On the desk, the 4 letters rested where I had left them. I ran my fingers gently over their surfaces, feeling the uneven edges of the envelopes. It struck me how simple they looked, how ordinary, and yet inside them was everything I had once tried to outrun. Now they felt like anchors, soft reminders that I didn't have to drift anymore. I made a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the world dry itself in the morning light. A man across the street was walking his dog, the leash glinting like a thread of silver. 2 children skipped through the puddles, their laughter bright and careless. The cafe door swung open and closed as customers came and went, each carrying with them the faint smell of roasted beans and pastries. Life had resumed, as it always does, gently and without ceremony. I thought about how often I had waited for perfect moments, how I told myself healing would arrive with some grand revelation, some cinematic change. But standing there, watching sunlight gather on the glass, I understood that healing had already been happening all along, in every quiet decision to stay, in every breath I had taken through the storm. I opened the window to let the air in. It was cool, carrying a hint of jasmine from the courtyard below. The curtains lifted slightly with the breeze, like lungs expanding after a deep inhale. Then, I took one of the clean pages from the drawer and began to write again, not a letter this time, but a few small thoughts I didn't want to lose. Healing is not the absence of rain, but the courage to stand still beneath it. Peace is not found in escape, but in return. The heart remembers its way home when we stop asking it to run. I wrote until the ink began to fade, the pen running dry. It felt fitting somehow that the words would stop exactly when they needed to. I set the page aside and looked around the room one more time. It no longer felt like a place I was staying in. It felt like mine. The books on the shelf, the seashell on the sill, the faint rings of tea stains on the desk, all small signatures of a life, quietly reclaimed as the day went on. Light shifted across the walls, moving slowly from gold to white. The air grew warmer. I watered the small plant near the window, its leaves still jeweled with droplets from last night. It stood upright, resilient, its green deepened by rain. I smiled at the thought that perhaps, in its own way, it too had been learning how to stay by afternoon. The clouds began to thin completely. The sky turned a pale, forgiving blue, the kind that makes you want to forgive yourself for all the years you didn't know how. I brewed one last cup of tea and carried it to the window seat. The steam rose softly, catching the sun. I watched the city stretch and move and breathe, its pulse steady, unhurried. For a long time, I said nothing. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, whispered or felt. I let my eyes close, the warmth of the cup seeping into my palms, the steady rhythm of life outside, carrying me somewhere gentle. And for that one small moment, between the last drops of rain and the promise of another day, I knew with quiet certainty I had found myself again. By nightfall, the rain returned, not as a storm, but as a hush. The kind that falls softly enough to sound like breathing, slow enough to calm the world. I turned off the lamp and sat by the window again, letting the faint glow of the city outside light the room. The streets shimmered like ribbons of silver, and the tree branches swayed gently in rhythm with the drizzle. It felt like the ending of something, though not in a sad way. More like the closing of a circle, the last quiet page of a long, gentle story. I breathed in deeply, the scent of wet earth, faint jasmine, and the familiar warmth of tea that had long gone cold. Everything smelled like peace. The 4 letters still rested on the desk. I didn't open them. I didn't need to anymore. Their words had already settled into me, line by line, until I could no longer tell where they ended, and I began. Took out one last sheet of paper and wrote just a single sentence. I'm still here. Then I folded it, not into an envelope, not to be kept or hidden away, but to let it rest beneath the others. A quiet full stop at the end of the story. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Outside, the cafe's sign flickered once before dimming for the night. The city was preparing to sleep, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to follow. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and leaned back in the chair. My reflection in the window was faint, almost transparent, merging with the rain-streaked glass. I could barely distinguish where my outline ended and the night began. It felt right that way. Healing, I realized, wasn't about becoming whole again. It was about learning to live gently with the cracks, to let the rain fall through you without washing you away, to understand that sometimes the quiet after the storm is enough. The sound of rain deepened, a soft, steady rhythm. It filled every corner of the room. I closed my eyes and listened. Each drop seemed to land in time with my breath, a conversation between the world and the part of me that had finally learned to stay. I thought about all the places I had once run to, the cities and strangers, the borrowed lives and temporary roofs. Each one had left something behind in me, something small and true. And now, sitting here, I could feel them all gently returning. Not as regret, but as understanding. Every version of me had been leading here to this night, this stillness, this quiet knowing. The candle on the desk had burned low, a thin wisp of smoke rising like a sigh. I didn't light another. The darkness didn't frighten me anymore. It felt soft, like velvet against my skin. I whispered into it, not expecting an answer. I made it. A breeze slipped through the half-open window, lifting the curtain just enough to brush my face. It was cool and kind. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its tires hissing through shallow puddles. Then silence returned, rain steady and calm. I let my eyes drift closed. The room faded into sound, the whisper of wind, the patter of water, the gentle tick of time. And beneath it all, my heartbeat steady, quiet, present. If someone had looked through the window just then, they might have seen nothing remarkable. A person sitting alone, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by the remnants of a long night. But to me, it felt like a homecoming. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring its own kind of noise, sunlight through curtains, footsteps in the hallway, the hum of another day beginning. But tonight belonged to the rain and to the quiet I had finally learned to keep. I didn't try to hold on to it. I simply let it be. The last thing I remember before sleep was the sound of the rain softening, the air cooling, and the faint reflection of myself in the window peaceful, half smiling, fading gently into the night. And in that silence, I understood I hadn't found peace outside the storm. I had found it within it. I was home.